So welcome those of you who are online. So we're on page 17 of the outline. If you're watching on the video in the subscribe section or the description section, if you just click on that on all our videos, there's a bibliography there for you that you can, so all the books that I recommend are in that bibliography, and then there's also an outline for you. And today we're going to look at, the bulk of what we're looking at is from a chapter from a preaching series by James Montgomery Boyce that he did. I don't know how long ago he did this, but I think it was in the 80s or 90s. He preached through the book of Genesis, and so there's 3 volumes on that. And James Boyce is one of my favorite Bible expositors. As a matter of fact, he wrote a lot of the material. Many of you are in BSF. He wrote a lot of the material for BSF. And so anyways, a guy that God used mightily while he was on earth, and still using through his writing and radio speaking ministry. You can still even hear him. He's got one of those booming voices that any preacher would love to have. I don't, but he had it. And so at the beginning of each session, I do want to open in prayer, and then I want to make some recommendations of resources to you, and then we'll dive into the outline. So let's pray. Father, I just want to thank you for each person here. Thank you that we got an extra hour sleep today, or at least an extra hour to get things done before coming to church. And Lord, I pray that you would bless the service today that's coming and our time now. Thank you that your word reveals to us what's true, and that we get to compare anything that we hear, anything that we read, anything that we see, anything that's taught to us with your scriptures. And we want to know what is objectively true for us and for everyone. And one of those things that we know is that you have provided a Savior for us who is Jesus. And everybody needs Jesus. And there's no salvation without him. So, Lord, I pray if anybody's watching or anybody here who doesn't know Jesus, that you would draw them unto Christ and the conviction that they are a sinner before a holy God, and that the only way of redemption, the only way of salvation for them is through Jesus Christ, and believing in his atonement for their sin, that he was buried, that he rose again, and that he's returning. And Lord, I pray that you would help all of us to not only know Jesus as Savior, but also as Lord, that he would be the one who guides and directs our lives. And so thank you for bringing us together to focus on things that really matter. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so I want to point out a few resources. So one resource I wrote here on the board, this guy is new to me. I just finished his book yesterday. K.P. Coulson, or Ken Coulson. I don't know what the P stands for, but K.P. Coulson. And he wrote a book called Creation Unfolding. And it's really a great book. For any of you who's interested in the dating, you know, how do we date the earth? How do we use dating methods? How do we interpret the Bible in light of there's so many people that are old earth creationists and there's theistic evolutionists? So what do we do with all that? And as far as the stuff I've read so far, I think for me, he's the biggest bang for your buck. He's a young earth guy, but again, it's sort of complicated. You have to sort of read the whole book to get the whole idea. And then he's got a website, too, that I just discovered called newcreation.blog. And again, his name's Ken Coulson. And this is his first book. He's from Australia. He has a PhD, I think, in geology. I could be wrong. Okay, but he has a PhD in some science, okay? And he's a young earth creationist, but he believes that what we learn from science by way of age, he thinks that it happened in a time-lapse manner, so that all the processes happen speedily. And he has this theory that that God created everything. So like from the time he creates on, he intervenes supernaturally every once in a while, like turning water into wine, and you have the miracle of Jesus' incarnation. And yet, if you did a study not knowing that he was born of a virgin, on his blood, for instance, you would probably find no different than normal people's blood and DNA and so forth. However, what he says is that God had the process of how everything develops and how everything multiplies and how everything goes from the point that he creates it. The process is all in his mind. And so therefore, even when he creates, he believes in a literal 6-day creation, 24-hour, 6-day creation, but all the processes that would have taken all the time that we figure out through science would have happened in sort of a time-lapse, like when you're watching like a plant flower or something on TV in a time-lapse manner, that it would go through the whole process. And if you studied it age-wise, that's what you would discover. But because God sped up the process. So anyway, all I have to say is I think it's a very interesting read. And I can't explain it as well as he does. So I just say he's new to me. I think he's sort of on the cutting edge of this. And I think he's really good at building bridges. He says basically everybody hates him. The old earth guys hate him. The young earth guys hate him. But he says, hey, relatively, this is a theory that, again, it's a theory. It needs to be tested. I could be proven false, whatever. But I think he does a really good job explaining it. So creation unfolding. So far, this has been my favorite book that I've read in preparing for this series. Really enjoyable book. As a matter of fact, I've read it twice, and I'm going to read it again just to understand it. And some of it's complicated, but most of it I think could be understood clearly. Another thing I want to point out to you, this is a good resource from a young earth perspective. It's 20 books. It's a 20-book pocket guide. I got it for $20. I think $26 was shipping. But 20 books put out by Answers in Genesis. And the titles are Astronomy, What is the Biblical Perspective? Is Atheism a Religion? Dinosaurs, Is there a Biblical Explanation? The Bible, How do we know it can be trusted? Climate Change, A Biblical Perspective in the Controversy. Logic and Faith, Discerning Truth in Logical Arguments. The Human Body, Intricate Design that Glorifies the Creator. Noah's Ark, A Biblical and Scientific Look at the Genesis Account. The Tower of Babel, The Origin and Dispersion of the Nations. UFOs and ETs, A Biblical and Cultural Explanation of Aliens. Exploration of Aliens. Social Issues, What does the Bible say about morality? Satan and the Serpent, A Biblical View of Satan and Evil. The Global Flood, A Biblical and Scientific Look at the Catastrophe that Changed the Earth. Human Missing Links. Evolution and Darwin. Did God create in 6 days? Should Christians believe in an old earth? Science versus the Bible. Best evidences for science and the Bible refute millions of years. And then a young earth, evidence that supports the biblical perspective. So there's 20 books that come in this. It's a good Christmas gift. I mean, it comes in a box. You can just wrap it and sit. It's called the 20 Pocket Value Set from Answers in Genesis. If you just go to the Answers in Genesis website, they have a store, and you can order it from that online. So Answers. If any of you need to look at this, it's up here. Okay. Just a plug. This has nothing to do with science, but a plug for next year's study that I'm already embarking on. I've already read 4 books on Calvin. But again, if you just want like 2 essential books on Calvin, this book, John Calvin by T.H.L. Parker, is considered sort of the standard biography from John Calvin experts. So if you want just one biography on John Calvin, this comes highly recommended. Oh, T.H.L. Parker. T.H.L. Parker, John Calvin. And then if you want his Institutes, this is considered by theologians to be one of the 10 or 5 most essential reads for any theologian. And it's Calvin's Institutes. And he wrote the first edition when he was only 26 years old. But if you want a hardback version, this version, the John Calvin Institutes of Christian Religion, translated by Henry Beveridge, it's published by Hendrickson. Just came out, I think, just recently. But yeah, 2022, April 2000, so just this year. This version came out. What's good about this version is the print is really nice to read. Earlier versions, the print's really small. So this has a really nice print to it. If you want it for 99 cents on Kindle, you can get it for 99 cents. They have a Kindle version that they just redid that has everything that you want to find in blue, so you could highlight it and it takes you there. The old version of Kindle didn't have that. 99 cents for Calvin's Institutes. So again, on Kindle. So anyway, that has nothing to do with science, but everything to do with theology, and I like theology better than science, so I'm just putting a plug for theology, okay? All right, with all that said, we're on page 17 of your outline. Again, if you're watching on video, we have a 27-page outline that you can print out, that you have a PDF of, and we're on page 17. So this is the last session in this outline. And then next week, Tyron's going to lead. Dana and I are going to be out of town. Tyron's going to show a video on the screen here that I would really encourage you to be here for. It's James Tour, another really good guy to be exposed to, who has a video channel on YouTube. We have Dan Smith, one of his star students from Rice University. And so Dan can testify what a studly guy James Tour is, not just his knowledge, but just what a gracious guy he is. He's a professor that has 40 people, at least 40 people over for dinner every week, and does Q&A, and he said his wife is an amazing cook, but he's the type of professor that anybody would want to have in college, and really cares about students, and is a light in the darkness in the scientific world. So anyways, so that's James Tour next week. Then when I come back the week after that, I'm going to do a 2-week series by Ron Colson from a book called Fast Facts on Evolution. So we're sort of just picking on evolution for a few weeks. But then when we're done with that, I want to spend the bulk of our time then saying, what is the evidence for creation science? For, what kind of evidence do we have that shows that God created and that God designed? And so we're going to spend the rest of our time going that direction. So again, back to the attack on naturalistic evolution. I'm going to read through this, and I'm just going to ask that you hold your questions till I'm done with the reading. So if anything pops in your mind, write it down or underline it or highlight if you want to ask me anything that I read here. But again, this is from a commentary, 3-volume commentary in the first volume from James Boyce. And I highly recommend that. He's, again, any commentary he's written on, I love. He's just a great Bible expositor and very smart guy. I mean, if he wasn't a pastor, he got his doctorate. He got a doctorate of theology from Harvard, and also went to Basel, Switzerland. He spoke 6 languages fluently. Very smart guy. And one of R.C. Sproul's best friends, as a matter of fact, when he always called him Jim Boyce. And when Jim Boyce died in 2002 of pancreatic cancer, he was given 6 weeks to live. He got exactly 6 weeks. He continued preaching. He continued writing hymns until he died. And he told his congregation, he said, "I've been teaching on the sovereignty of God my whole life. I'm not going to change my view. If you want to pray for my healing, that's fine." But he just said, "I believe in God's sovereign plan. It's time for me to go home." So it doesn't change anything I've taught you. I'm just going to keep teaching you what I've always taught you, that God's plans and God's ways are not ours. This is my time. I'm ready to go home. And but R.C. Sproul said that James Boyce's death was God's judgment on the United States. And very interesting. I mean, he really believes that. He believes that he was the most important, influential Christian of the last century. And he said that for God to take him early was God's he believed was God's judgment on the United States. So, whether he was right or not, who knows? What I do know is that we deserve judgment, okay? and God has been plenty merciful. Go vote. Hopefully God will continue his mercy on us. Oh yeah, naturalistic evolution. So Genesis 1:1-2, which is what we'll be looking at for weeks. Today we'll be looking at the fourth word in that verse, God. But in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. When Charles Darwin published The Origin of the Species in 1859, he received more abuse than perhaps any modern scientist. So again, people weren't favorable initially. To be sure, even Einstein originally objected to Slipher's discovery of an expanding universe. He wrote, quote, "This circumstance irritates me," end quote. Others also objected, but none of these heaped personal abuse on Slipher. Darwin, by contrast, was greeted with, quote, "rotten fabric of speculation, utterly false, deep in the mire of folly, and I laughed till both my sides were sore." Okay. The remarkable thing, however, is that the theory that became the laughingstock and then eventually the battleground of the second half of the 19th century has now become widely accepted, not only by scientists, but also by a wide variety of people from most walks of life. Let us say at the beginning that the final answer as to how the universe came into being may not be attainable now. We may exclude some possibilities, both as Christians and as scientists. As Christians, we may exclude even more. But this still falls short of a full answer to the how. Indeed, even taking the explanations of origins in the order proposed above does not necessarily imply that the latter positions are better than the earlier ones. They are taken in this order simply because they have appeared in this order historically. So let's look at the evolutionary theory. We begin by noting that in spite of the association of evolution with the name of Charles Darwin, evolution itself is nothing new. It existed among the ancient Greeks. For example, Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Epicurus, Lucretius were all evolutionists. So also was Aristotle, 382 to 322 BC, who believed in a complete gradation in nature accompanied by a perfecting principle. This was imagined to have caused gradation from the imperfect to the perfect. Man, of course, stood at the highest point of the ascent. Again, there were evolutionists in more modern times before Darwin. Some early precursors were Francis Bacon from 1561 to 1626, René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, and Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804. The first biologist to make a contribution to evolutionary thought was Georges-Louis Leclerc de Buffon, 1707-1788, the French naturalist. Another was Erasmus Darwin, 1731 to 1802, the grandfather of Charles Darwin. The first fairly complete theory of evolution was by Chevalier de Lamarck, 1744 to 1829, who became a professor in zoology at the Museum of Natural History in Paris and later popularizing his views in Philosophie Zoologique. It was Charles Darwin, however, who rightly captured the world's attention. His theory was developed to a degree that none of the others were, and perhaps even more importantly, it was supported by an impressive array of observations collected initially on the world-encircling tour of the HMS Beagle from 1831 to 1836. Darwin's theory may be arranged in these postulates and conclusions. Postulate number 1, variation. There are variations within individuals of the same species. Postulate number 2, overproduction. In most cases, more individuals are born to a species than can possibly survive to maturity. Conclusion number 1, struggle for existence. In order to survive, individuals must compete with other members of the same species. Postulate number 3, survival of the fittest. In a competitive environment, only those individuals best fitted to survive will survive. Postulate number 4, inheritance of favorable characteristics. Fit individuals pass their good characteristics to their descendants. And final conclusion, new species arise by the continued survival and reproduction of the individuals best suited to their particular environment. So what has happened to this theory in the 100 or so years since the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species? For the most part, it is still held, though much work has been done in the area that presents a flaw in the argument. As anyone can see, the chief mechanism of evolution according to Darwin's theory is natural selection. The impersonal preference given to a certain variation in a species permitting one individual rather than another to survive. This is supposed to explain how the variety of forms we know came about. But this is precisely what it does not do. Natural selection may explain how certain individuals have more offspring than others and therefore survive, or survive and have offspring while other less favored individuals do not. But it does not tell us how there came to be the various organisms or good characteristics of organisms in the first place. Thomas Bethel, editor of the Washington Monthly, has written of this problem in an article for Harper's Magazine. He observes, quote, "There is then no selection by nature at all, nor does nature act as it so often is said to do in biology books. One organism may indeed be fitter than another from an evolutionary point of view, but the only event that determines this fitness is death or infertility. This, of course, is not something which helps create the organism, but is something that terminates it." End quote. To deal with this problem, evolutionists have come to speak of mutations as the primary source of variations. This was proposed first by a Dutch botanist, Hugo de Vries, in a work entitled Species and Varieties, Their Origin by Mutation in 1905. It has since been suggested that mutations are caused by cosmic radiations, the latter being perhaps far more intense than in modern times. How about the fossil record? What are we to say of Darwin's theory? We must begin by noting that there is no question on the part of any informed thinker or writer that there are varieties within a given species. This is simply to say that all individuals are not alike. Some are tall, some are short, some are strong, others weak, and so on. The question is whether these acknowledged variations are sufficient to account for the development of entirely different species, and, second, whether such development has in fact occurred. The possibility of the development of species in this manner does not prove that this is the way it happened. At this point, we have to turn to the evidence for evolution. And when we do, we must acknowledge that the only true historical evidence is the evidence of fossils. There are other things that may be seen as supporting evolution, the possibility of classifying organisms from the simple to the more complex, similarities of structure in related species, the existence of vestigial organs, that is, organs like the human appendix for which no present function is known, similar blood types between some species, but these are all circumstantial arguments, and in some cases they're also ambiguous. The only true historical evidence that evolution has actually occurred, is fossils. The fossil remains may be evidence of evolution, but what is not adequately said today is that they do not prove evolution and are in fact highly questionable when applied to evolutionary theory. Let us begin with positive statements. First, although very fragmentary, the fossils do lend themselves to a historical sequence in which the more simple forms of life may be dated earlier because found in older rock, and more complex forms of life may be dated later. Thus, although the very ancient dates given may be wrong, it does seem that algae, protozoa, and sponges came first. After that are fish, reptiles, and amphibians, then the land animals, including the dinosaurs. Finally, there are the animals we know today, and then men. Another positive statement is that some species have become extinct, the dinosaurs being the most notable example. The combination of these two sets of observations suggests that new forms of life develop and that others become extinct, according to Darwin. But it is not that simple. There are problems in fitting the fossil record into an evolutionary system. Moreover, these are so great as to bring the entire theory into question. For example, if evolution is true, what we should expect to find in the fossil record is finely graded and generally continuous development from the simplest forms to the higher forms. Although this is often claimed for the fossil record, it is not what is in fact found when we study it closely. Certainly, there are simpler forms in presumably earlier rocks. Higher forms, like man, come relatively late. But there are no gradual developments. On the contrary, the major groups appear suddenly, and there is little or no evidence of transition. Everett C. Olson, a well-known evolutionist, mentions this difficulty. Quote, "More important, however, are the data revealed by the fossil record. There are great spatial and temporal gaps, sudden appearances of new major groups, equally sudden appearances of old, including very rapid extinctions of groups that had flourished for long periods of time. There were mass extinctions marked by equally simultaneous death of several apparently little associated groups of organisms. At the time the record first is seen with any real clarity in Cambrian rock strata, the differentiation of phyla is virtually complete. As far as major groups are concerned, we see little clear evidence of time succession and differentiation, with the simpler first and the more complex later," end quote. It may be argued at this point, indeed, it is argued by evolutionists, that the fossil record is simply incomplete. That if fossils for every prior form of life existed, such gaps would be filled. But in 100 years of study, the tendency has not been this way, and it is hard to convince oneself today that this will yet happen. It is not just a question of several missing links. There are hundreds of missing links. Moreover, the grouping of major species in certain past periods of Earth's history works strongly against this argument. Christians can argue, even if they cannot fully prove, that special creation is a far better explanation. A second major problem with the use of fossils to support evolution is the subjective nature of arranging fossil histories. It might be argued by one who has seen the difficulty just mentioned that there is nevertheless evidence for development within one of the ancient time periods, even if not from one to the other. The supposed development of the horse from the Eocene period to modern times is an off-cited example. During 60 million or so years, the horse is supposed to have increased in size, lengthened its limbs, reduced and then eventually discarded toes, and become a grazer. Many museums have skeletons or pictures that are supposed to represent this development. But the fossils do not prove this development. They may suggest it, and the development they suggest may in fact be right, but there is still no evidence that one supposed form of the horse gave place to another. In actuality, the skeletons may have come from similar but otherwise unrelated animals. Moreover, even if the fossils of these horse-like animals prove a development, it is still not an example of the development of a new species, but only of a change within a species. How about mutations? Another area of difficulty for evolution is the mechanism used to explain the emergence of significant variations in the species, chiefly mutations. Sudden, unexpected changes brought about by otherwise unexplained alterations in the organism's genes. This was the solution to the problem of newness proposed by Hugo de Vries. De Vries did his work with the evening primrose, a weed that he found in a potato field. He bred this plant over a period of several generations, in the course of which he noticed a number of abrupt changes that he called mutations. He concluded that these were developments of such magnitude that the process itself could explain the emergence of new species. Unfortunately, the new species of de Vries were not new species, but simply varieties within the same species. Moreover, they were not produced by mutations in the sense of that word today, but rather by breeding out recessive characteristics. In other words, de Vries produced nothing that was not in the plan originally. De Vries' failure does not entirely discredit the theory, however, for mutations do occur and can be passed down from generation to generation. The question is whether these mutations are sufficient to account for new species. Are they? Many evolutionists would say yes at this point, but it is important to note that no one has demonstrated this to be so. In fact, there is important evidence to the contrary. Walter Lammerts is a rose breeder from Southern California and the author of the books Why Not Creation and Scientific Studies in Creation. He tells of attempts to breed roses with more petals or less petals, using every imaginable technique, including radiation. He acknowledges that it is possible to use radiation to create roses with a significant increase in petals. But here's the point. There is a limit beyond which the increase in petals apparently will not go. If a rose has 44 petals, for example, it may be reduced to 32 or increased to 56. But that is all. Moreover, if the hybrid rose is left to mix with others from that point on, it does not retain its new characteristics, but soon loses them. In fact, all the hybrid roses we have would soon turn to wild roses if left to themselves, because they are bred from the wild roses originally. And if that in itself is not enough to cast doubt on the theory, there is the fact that the improved roses did not attain their improved form naturally, but rather through the concentrated and prolonged efforts of Lammerts and other breeders. In other words, even in so limited a matter of this, there is need for design and a designer, a planner, and a plan. And I say, amen. Okay? The crucial areas. An essay such as this can only begin to suggest a few of the problems the theory of evolution poses. But even in such a short study, concentrating on the basic scientific evidence for and against evolution, we can hardly pass over the far greater, and from the point of view of the Christian, unsolvable problems that exist where the crucial points of evolution are concerned. There are 4 of them. First, even were we to grant the truthfulness of the evolutionary system as currently put forth, we still have the problem of the origin of the matter from which the latter forms sprang. Evolution implies matter by the very meaning of the word. For in order for something to evolve, there must be something there in the first place to evolve. And that first something cannot evolve, but rather must be either eternally present or created. Since the eternity of matter is today increasingly untenable, as we saw in a previous study, we must have God as creator. And this obviously nudges us towards the Christian position, whatever our opinions of a greater or lesser degree of evolutionary development may be. Second, there is the form of matter, the form of matter. We must speak of mere matter as if it were a simple, irreducible entity, but we do not actually know of any such simple matter, and cannot in fact even conceive of it. Everything we know, however simple, already has a form, generally a highly complex form. Even hydrogen, the basic building block of everything according to astrophysics, is not simple. It has a proton, neutron, and electron, all operating according to fixed laws. Where did this fixed form and laws come from? They did not evolve. They are in matter to start with. Third, there is the emergence of life. This is a complex problem, and much has been done to develop laboratory models according to which life could have arisen on Earth during the early ages of the planet. The most acceptable model is a 3-stage process involving, number 1, the origin of bioorganics, amino acids and sugars, from inorganic compounds, hydrogen, water, ammonia, carbon dioxide, and methane. Secondly, the origin of biopolymers, large molecules such as proteins, from the bioorganics. And finally, number three, the origin of primordial life, simple plant or algae-like cells from the biopolymers. But this is an extremely complex process, even assuming that this is how life came about, and therefore has an extremely low level of probability. True, scientists have achieved the first two of these stages in carefully controlled laboratory experiments. But the crucial third stage is elusive. And even in the second stage, the polymers seem to deteriorate faster than they would normally be created in anything approaching a natural environment. Again, it is not a matter of a single event of low probability. It is a matter of a long series of events, each with a very small probability, so that, as one writer says, quote, "For all practical purposes, the probability of this series of events may safely be regarded as zero," end quote. Two scientists who nevertheless believe in the spontaneous generation of life write, quote, "The macromolecule to cell transition is a jump of fantastic dimensions, which lies beyond the range of testable hypothesis. In this area, all is conjecture. The available facts do not provide a basis for postulating that cells arose on this planet," end quote. The fourth of the truly great problems for an atheistic theory of evolution is the emergence of personality in man, or, to be more specific, the emergence of the soul, spirit, or God consciousness. What caused non-man to become man? One writer asks, quote, "Where did the soul of man come from? Why is it that the highest and best animals are unable to pray? They are unable to communicate in a rational way. They are unable to do the things that man is able to do. The lowest type of man upon the face of the earth is a far higher than the highest of the animals, because he has the capacity to worship God and can be brought to be a child of God, able to live in the glory of God through Jesus Christ. And that is true of none of the animals." The writer concludes, quote, "I am not ashamed to say that I believe in the first chapter of Genesis, but I should be ashamed to say that I held to any form of evolution," end quote. Why evolution? Another reason we believe why evolution continues to be taught, this is Ron Carlson, so I'm going to be looking at him 2 weeks from now. Another reason we believe why evolution continues to be taught in spite of the contrary evidence is the educational mindset that grips our schools today. Our schools have essentially, quote, "ruled out the answer before they ask the question," end quote. They have said, quote, "There is no God. Now let's ask the question, what is the origin of life?" End quote. The reason they never find the answer is because they ruled it out before they asked the question. It is highly unscientific and anti-intellectual to rule out answers before you ask questions. The tragedy is that evolution is a 19th century philosophy that has been destroyed by 20th century science. Yet the lie continues to be perpetuated not on scientific grounds, but because it is what morally justifies our immoral society today. Okay, nailed it. Dr. Philip E. Johnson, professor of law at the University of California at Berkeley, he's since gone to be with the Lord just a few years ago, has written a book exposing the falsehood of evolution entitled Darwin on Trial. He was speaking at a conference when he was asked this question: why is evolution still taught when it's such a weak theory of origins? His reply was very interesting, coming from someone within the academic community. Most professors continue to teach evolution in the universities out of fear. This fear is that of not being tenured, of not getting research grants, of not being published, and of not being accepted by their peers. So, to be accepted, to be published, to be granted research money, and to be tenured by their university, they must follow the party line, which is evolution. This is how the academic game is played. Okay, he's dead on right. I conclude with this question. Why is it, if the theory of evolution is as weak as it seems to be, that it has the popular appeal acknowledged at the beginning of this essay? Why is it that evolution is today's dominant view and not one of other views mentioned? I think there are 4 answers, 3 of which I want to put in the form of statements, and 1 of which I want to put in the form of a question. The statements are these. First, according to evolution, everything, absolutely everything, is knowable, and this has obvious appeal. Everything comes from something else, and we can trace the developments back. It is a closed system. There is no need for anything outside. Above all, there is no need for God, who by the very definition of that word is one who is unknowable and who does not need to give an account of himself. Second, according to evolution, there is one explanation for everything. Everything evolves. Matter, life, ideas, even religion. We can project this framework from our own small world throughout the universe. Third, and this is perhaps the chief reason, if creation of the world by God is eliminated, as many clearly wish to do, evolution is the only other option. On the basis of those 3 statements, I now ask my question. Is it not possible then that in the last analysis, the appeal of evolution is in its elimination of God and its exaltation of man? In this system, man does not merely become the highest point of creation, which Christians would themselves willingly affirm. He becomes the God of creation. Consequently, to challenge evolution is to blaspheme against man. And blasphemy against man is the sin for which there is no pardon. Algernon Charles Swinburne gives expression to this spirit in his Hymn of Man. But God, if God there be, is the substance of men, which is man. Thou art smitten, thou God, thou art smitten. Thy death is upon thee, O Lord, and the love song of earth, as thou deist, resounds through the winds of her wings. Glory to man in the highest, for man is the master of things. Yeah, does anybody have a throw-up bag? Okay, CNN would love that. But anyway, is man the master? If he is, then he can go his way and devise any theory of origins he chooses. But if he is not, if there is a God, then he is the creation of this God and owes this God allegiance. Antony Flew wrote a book before he died called There Is a God. In the title it says There Is No God. And then it's crossed out, There Is a God, because he was one of the foremost atheists of the 20th century. And he ended up becoming a Christian through intelligent design arguments. So whether he became a Christian or not is up in the air. I hope we see him in heaven. But he debated many theists over his lifetime and was considered one of the most notorious atheists. He actually, unlike Richard Dawkins, like if you hear any of the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, who's now dead, he knows better now, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett, who are considered the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. If you watch them debate, they really don't have good arguments. But Antony Flew, the older atheist, did have good arguments. They were concerned about objective truth. Modern atheists are just ad hominem arguments. They just really attack anything to do with an opposing view. And there's a difference. So I prefer reading the older atheists. They're just more cogent in their argumentation. They use logic rather than ad hominem arguments, one after the other. Just spewing hatred and vitriol is not an argument. Okay, that's what we see on TV. That's what we see with politicians. That's what we see with people that don't have an argument. Okay? So, here's what Antony Flew says in There Is a God. I now believe, this is a quote from him, I now believe that the universe was brought into existence by an infinite intelligence. I believe that this universe's intricate laws manifest what scientists have called the mind of God. I believe that life and reproduction originate in a divine source. Why do I believe this? Given that I expounded and defended atheism for more than half a century, the short answer is this. This is the world picture as I see it, that has emerged from modern science. Although I was once sharply critical of the argument to design, I have since come to see that when correctly formatted, this argument constitutes a persuasive case for the existence of God. So here's an honest guy who, I think he was in his late 70s or 80s when he came to that conclusion. Alvin Plantinga, the next quote, he's arguably the greatest Christian philosopher in the world. Anybody who's a Christian philosopher considers him the Einstein of philosophy. And he's also very well respected even by pagans and atheists and what have you. But Alvin Plantinga said this. He said, if we don't know that there is such a person as God, we don't know the first thing, the most important thing about ourselves, each other, and our world. This is because the most important truths about us and them is that we have been created by the Lord and utterly depend upon Him for our continued existence. End quote. J.I. Packer, a great theologian who wrote Knowing God, said, disregard the study of God and you sentence yourself to stumble and blunder through life blindfolded. We are cruel to ourselves if we try to live in this world without knowing about the God whose world it is and who runs it. And then R.C. Sproul, my buddy, in Enjoying God, wrote this. He said, God exists by His own power. He alone is self-existent. Aseity, meaning self-existence, is the characteristic that separates Him from all other things. God is the only one who can say, I am who I am. The grand difference between a human being and a supreme being is precisely this. Apart from God, I cannot exist. Apart from me, God does exist. God does not need me in order for Him to be. I do need God in order for me to be. This is the difference between what we call a self-existent being and a dependent being. In Him, we have our being. It is because of His self-existence that we can exist at all. You and I exist in His power and by His power. We are because He is. All right. Okay, we got a few minutes for questions, so I'll do what I can. I think a very powerful, concise, clear, logical argument there, right? That's why I like James Boyce. He's just very compelling in his argumentation. So, all right. Any questions at all?
Just a comment.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Comments are good too.
Down in Biola, they used to have a yearly symposium on Christian philosophy and religions. And one year I went down and heard these guys. Mm-hmm. And they also had a handout book from one of the departments on different arguments for evolution, creation. And one of those was from Flew. And it was the beginning of his turning around. And it's an intense piece that he wrote. As an interview, you could see his starting to turn around to realize that there is a God. And things came from God rather than evolving by man.
Yeah.
Really, really cool.
Good.
I don't know if they still do it. Do you know?
They probably do. Yeah, so J.P. Moreland, so I went to Talbot and at Biola University, and that's where I got my Master of Divinity. And so J.P. Moreland has a really brilliant strategy. When he came to Talbot, unfortunately I was there before they started an MA in apologetics, which I would have dove right into had they had it. They started it the year after I graduated. So I think they started in 1992, and I graduated in 91. So I got my MDiv there, but I took 4 classes from J.P. Moreland. And J.P. Moreland is, if you've ever read J.P. Moreland, it's like you need aspirin or Excedrin. You get like an Excedrin headache when you read him because he's just so off the charts smart. And he uses a lot of logic and a lot of syllogisms, so you have to really pay attention to what he writes. But J.P. Moreland, he had the idea. So he's actually planted 2 thriving churches. He planted a church along with Walt Russell in Baltimore that is a church of like over 2,000 people. Wow. Very smart guy, very evangelistic, very good communicator. He could put the cookies on the bottom shelf when he needs to. But his idea was, churches, a lot of good churches, like our church does this. Every church I've pastored has done this. We give 10% of our budget to missions. And most evangelical churches are big on world missions, and we should be. But he said, why don't we do anything about local missions? And one of the best ways to do local missionary work is to support Christian professors on secular campuses. Because who controls the media? Who controls politics? Who controls the judicial system? Who controls government? I mean, you name it. It's all the liberals that have come out of Marxist indoctrination in our universities. Okay, that's hands down true. Okay? So he's like, we need to get back into the universities. We need to get our universities back. And we can't do it without money. And we can't do it without people getting PhDs and staying in these universities. The problem is, like with scientists, for instance, who's going to hire them? This guy can't be hired. K.P. Colson will not be hired in any secular university. He won't even be hired in a lot of Christian universities because he's a young earth creationist that they laugh at and mock. So it's very challenging. But one of the ways they've been able to get into the university is through philosophy. So he and Alvin Plantinga, who I just quoted, Alvin Plantinga, Richard Swinburne, several others that are well-known philosophers and well-respected even among atheistic philosophers, they decided to start praying about, we need to really push to our churches and our schools. Let's get our brightest, oftentimes our brightest Christians we send on the mission field or the pastors, which there's nothing wrong with that. But we also need bright people in the universities as philosophy teachers, as English teachers, as history professors, as even scientists if they can get hired. So when they started that in 1992, their goal was for people to do an MA in philosophy and apologetics, and then go on to get their PhDs at secular universities, but to double study. So that MA program is very rigorous. It's the most difficult MA program in the country because it takes double study. They got to study everything everybody studies in the secular university and get the Christian worldview as well. But they're going in as professors that are missionaries of the gospel on secular campuses. So because of that, the intelligent design movement sort of coincided with that. And because of that, there's a lot of people in the intelligent design movement, like Michael Behe, who already have tenure. Yeah. And they actually attract, like Michael Behe has put Lehigh University on the map because of his writing and because of his speaking. But his professors on his staff, they admire him, they appreciate him, but some of them don't like him and attack him regularly. And so he's in an environment that's very difficult. But again, he's a guy and he's actually a theistic evolutionist. Okay, he's a Christian, he's a believer, but he holds to theistic evolution, but he's pointing people at least to a creator and to design. And his writings are a part of the intelligent design movement. So I say all that to say the good news is that before they started this idea and sort of this strategy, the top philosophical society in America has 2,000 members. When they took a poll in 1980 of those 2,000 members, they found out that 70% of the members were atheists. The same society took a poll 10 years ago, so I think in 2010, 2011, with 3,000 members, and found that 60% of the members are theists. So that's a big change. And that's good, because usually where Christians are attacked at the secular university is in their philosophy classes. You know, there are a lot of philosophy professors that are more than happy to annihilate your idea that there's a God, and will do everything in their power to get you to see how stupid and foolish you are to think that there could possibly be this myth that is God, and take great glee in attacking Christians, Jews, Muslims, what have you. But again, so there's been a strategy to get English professors, philosophy professors, anybody you can get into these secular universities with the strategy of taking back universities for God. And I think that's a smart thing. It's a smart thing to do. It's something we should support more than we do.
His class was always overflowing, like there were...
J.P. Moreland? Yeah.
J.P. Moreland.
Yeah.
We were standing there, so
yeah.
If I wanted to hear him lecture, I had to get there early and sit at the door so I could get in.
Yeah.
He was, and when he spoke, it was with like humbleness.
Yeah.
And yet he's like so smart.
Yeah, he's off the charts smart. And he writes for both crowds. He's published in over 200 journals. From science, philosophy, you name it. But he also writes a lot of very practical, easy to read books as well. And he wrote a book that our elders just recently read called Simple Guide to Miracles. And so really to expect and pray for miracles. And so he's just he's very evangelistic, but his view is that a very strategic thing for us to do as Christians is to not pull out of the public square, but to pull into it, but intelligently. Yeah. Use your wits. Don't be ad hominem like the rest of them. They go for the jugular, use a good argument. Yeah. Don't get defensive, don't come at them. We have to be smart in the way we do that. Bill Bright, who started Campus Crusade for Christ, which unfortunately is going woke. It's really a tragedy that they're going woke, which is just, I think even Bill Bright would, he's not he's alive, he's probably watching this, he's probably seen this, but Bill Bright, one of his goals too was, his goal, if you ask Bill Bright, what's your vision, what's your goal? His goal was for everybody on the planet to hear the gospel. And through the Jesus film, that's one of the reasons they came up with the Jesus film is, well, one of our biggest problems is we use these 4 spiritual laws, but a lot of people can't read. So we're handing them out spiritual laws, and it's like they're trying to just make out the pictures and figure it out, unless somebody explains it to them. But he said with the video, they're able to go all over the world, translate the video into all these languages, and over 2 billion people have seen the Jesus film. Wow. And many, many, many millions of people have come to Christ through that video. But another one of his goals is he started King's College in New York, and the whole idea was to have an Ivy League level school that trains people in the main influence areas of society, like the arts, the law, you name it. But basically the goal is to not send those people that are trained and get their PhDs into the Christian universities, but to send them into the public square. And so that's what King's College does. There's a few colleges and universities that have this mentality. Hillsdale College has this mentality. There's a few, but there's not enough. Yeah. And unfortunately, what's happened instead of that idea is cultural relativism and wokeness has penetrated a lot of Christian schools. And so now there's a lot of Christian schools that are just as bad as their secular counterparts. So this is warfare. This is a battle. This is the reality that we're in. But again, thank God for smart people that see the writing on the wall and go, okay, we need to do something about this. We need to get strategic about this and not just let the enemy have his way everywhere. But it's not without a cost. It's not without a battle. So thanks for bringing that. But yeah, I think they still have forums and meetings and conferences and all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
It was a fun weekend.
I bet.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. No, that's cool. All right. Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
This is so clear that I would just like to pass these out to various people that I know that are non-religious. I'm not sure that they'd read it, but it's fascinating.
Well,
for one who doesn't.
Yeah, go ahead and give it to them and see what happens. Pray that they read it. Again, it's like when you pass out Bibles. You don't know if they're going to read it or not, but if they read it, it has the power to change their life. And again, that's all we can do. We're just seed planters. Ultimately, we're all farmers for God. We just plant as many seeds as you can. And let God do. Only God can do the saving. It is interesting. I've read. Hugh Ross, who's probably the most well-known old Earth creationist, somebody gave him a Gideon Bible when he was in high school, but he didn't read it until he was in post-grad school. And he read it actually in comparing it with other religions. He was in Canada at the time. He's Canadian. He's from Canada. And he was in school to be getting his PhD in astrophysics. And so while he was working on his PhD, he decided to see what do religions have to say about science. And so he read the Quran, he read the Book of Mormon, he read the Bhagavad Gita, and so forth. What he found is that in the other religions, they all had mistakes scientifically in their religious writings. They were all mistakes. When he read the Bible, it was the first religious book he read that was like, wow, this actually adheres to science. And through that, he decided to read the whole Bible. And through reading the Bible, he became a Christian. Another great story about somebody who was handed a Gideon Bible is Christopher Ewan. Christopher Ewan came over from, I can't remember which Asian country he came over from, but his parents were a typical Asian family, very high academic, you got to go as far as you can with education, and you need a good job and get straight A's, and just very hard, heavy work ethic and education ethic. But while he became a dentist, and when he became a dentist, he also started exploring in that he had same-sex attraction, and he ended up getting very active in the homosexual lifestyle, and then his parents pretty much disowned him because of that. But somebody had given him a Bible, a Gideon Bible, and when he was in prison, I can't remember what he went to prison for. I think it was drugs. It was drugs related. He was selling drugs or something. So he ended up in prison in Tennessee, and somebody had given him a Bible, and he got rid of it. And then one day, somebody asked him if he'd teach the Bible in the prison. He's a practicing homosexual, and for whatever reason, they asked him. And he goes, well, I don't know anything, but I'd be happy to learn. So he was rummaging through the trash and found a Bible in the trash. And he started teaching the Bible because he didn't even have a Bible. But it was a Gideon Bible. And he started teaching through the Gideon Bible. He's teaching a Bible study in prison as a practicing homosexual who doesn't know whether there's a God or not. And he's teaching the Bible. While he's reading the Bible and teaching the Bible, he discovers that homosexuality is idolatry, and it's a sin against God. It's not God's design. He confesses his sin, he repents of his sin, he puts his trust in Christ, and he keeps teaching the Bible. And eventually he gets out of prison, and now he's a professor at Moody Bible Institute. Wow. And he's a guy that says he probably will struggle with same-sex attraction the rest of his life, but he chooses to follow God's word and not capitulate to sexual sin, but give his life to Christ. And so he speaks all over the country and all over the world, helping people get out of, to not justify homosexuality, but to repent of it and have God's best instead of Satan's worst.